Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the Rhode Island vampire. Admittedly, witch and vampire hunts aren't exactly a topic covered in most history classes, but this is truly a pretty crazy story. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis was spreading pretty rapidly in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont. This obviously would have been pretty terrifying for the residents of these places, but things quickly took a very dark turn. Since many of the people who were passing away from this illness appeared very obviously ill with sunken, drained faces, for some reason, the logical response was that people believed that they had been the prey of vampires. There was a family in Exeter, Rhode Island that had multiple people pass away from the illness, so some people believed that someone in this family must be the feeding vampire. They even went as far as to exhume the bodies of some of the deceased family members to make sure that they weren't undead. One of the exhumed bodies had passed away more recently, so her body was in better condition, which people of course took as a sign of her being a vampire. This led to them burning her heart and liver, and then they mixed the ashes with water. This is most definitely a crime today and pretty scary, but to make things even worse, they gave this concoction to other people in the town who had fallen ill as some kind of a cure. Imagine having to drink that and then still having tuberculosis after. Definitely not a good trade-off. In our number 9 spot today, we have India and World War II. It would be shocking to hear of a school not teaching anything about World War II, but it's often that we don't truly get the full scope of what went on. One thing I saw brought up a few times was the role that India played in the war and what they went through. Firstly, if you didn't know, India played a huge part in the Second World War. We normally hear of the large death tolls from such as the 418,000 Americans who died, or the 450,000 people from the UK, which, don't get me wrong, is a huge and terrible number. But it is estimated that 3 million Indian people died in World War II, which is something I have literally never heard of anyone talk about before. India was fighting Japan, which for the record also had an extremely high death toll in this war, on the Eastern Front, and they were fighting Germany on the Western. World War II is a part of our global history, so why don't we talk about it and how it affected all of the countries? In our number 8 spot today, we have the Acadian expulsion. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far. This is something that happened in my own country, you guys, and I can honestly say this was never taught at the schools I attended. The Acadians were descendants of the 17th and 18th century French settlers who settled in the area that is now the Canadian Maritimes, so New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. In 1730, Acadians had to swear to British authorities that they would remain neutral on any conflict between Britain and France. Basically, one thing led to another, and the governor of Nova Scotia at the time, Charles Lawrence, saw the Acadians as some kind of a threat, and he also wondered why people who weren't from the area were allowed to live on such a beautiful part of the land. Well, isn't that real rich coming from someone who also wasn't from the area? But that is a whole separate conversation. Charles tried to force the Acadians to take an unqualified oath of allegiance to Britain, and when they refused, he imprisoned them and then ordered them to be deported. A man from New England called Charles Morris came up with the disgusting idea to surround the Acadian churches on a Sunday morning and capture as many people as possible while also burning their houses and crops. This whole situation led to approximately 10,000 Acadians being deported, and apparently this whole ordeal had a fatality rate of 53% for the Acadians. This whole thing is honestly pretty disgraceful, and it's just something that we don't talk about. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Iranian Revolution of 1979. On August 19th, 1978, at the Cinema Rex in Abadan, Iran, there were hundreds of people watching a film when 4 men barricaded the doors, doused the cinema in gasoline, and lit the whole thing ablaze. This was a key event that led to the following revolution of 1979, but it truthfully had been building for quite some time, and this obviously wasn't the only event that led to this movement. This revolution was unique in the fact that it lacked a lot of the usual causes, such as a defeat in war, or a gigantic national debt, or an uprising of those in poverty. There is a lot that happened and a lot that went into this revolution, and I truly do not have time to cover in this video even half of it. But this revolution not only toppled Iran's absolute monarch, but it had worldwide political repercussions that are still seen today. In our number 6 spot today, we have Cyrus the Great. It is entirely possible that you may have learned about Cyrus the Great in school, as he was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, but there is one thing he did that apparently a lot of us didn't know that possibly changed the course of our history. After he took Babylon over, he freed all of the captured slaves in the city and let them go back to their homelands. This included the Hebrews who were captured and enslaved from Judea. This may seem like a nice and reasonable thing to do, but it truly was more than that. By allowing these people to be free and return to their homes and continue practicing their religions, this may have been what has kept some religions alive. Without this move, it is possible that we may not have Judaism, Christianity, or Islam today, and that would have made our entire history very, very different. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Italian Renaissance dark side. When we think of the Italian Renaissance period, it is known for development and the rebirth that it caused, which makes a lot of sense considering the word Renaissance literally means rebirth. But there is one less glamorous and slightly frightening side to this period that isn't widely talked about. Sailors who had been returning from the New World at this point brought something less than lovely back with them, and that was syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. After this, the troops brought what was called the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. Since there was no penicillin or banana medicine back then, the disease spread rapidly and the symptoms were pretty gruesome. It would often happen that a person who had fallen ill would have the skin on their faces essentially be rotting away, which would leave large ulcers. Some people's noses and lips would be pretty much gone, and it happened often that people would sadly pass away from the disease. So basically what we think of as a beautiful time in Europe was both world-changing, but also very scary, and pretty close to a zombie apocalypse. In our number 4 spot today, we have the history of dentures. I suppose this one is less of an event and more of a weird practice, but I just had to include it. I don't have a ton of experience with dentures, but they seem to be a pretty straightforward thing these days, aside from the cost of dental, but things weren't always the way they are today. Instead of dentures being made of fake teeth, before, they used to be made with real human teeth, which is absolutely disgusting to me. After the Battle of Waterloo, scavengers went and took the teeth off of the corpses, which is quite a job, and then they sold these teeth to dentists. These dentists would boil the teeth, chop the roots off, and then attach these teeth to ivory base plates and then sell them to the customers. Aside from this being an extremely morally questionable practice in its entirety, it is also just so creepy. In our number 3 spot today, we have telephone cats. If you're a cat person, you might want to skip over this number. In 1929, 2 scientists at Princeton University wanted to conduct an experiment in order to test how auditory nerves perceive sounds. This is obviously extremely important research, but the way they went about this is truly messed up. They took a sedated but alive cat and cut out a part of its brain. They then attached one end of a telephone wire to the cat's auditory nerve and then the other end to a telephone receiver. When one of these scientists spoke into the cat's ear, the other one could hear it on the other end. This is cool, but most definitely not an excuse to do something so inhumane. There were, of course, benefits to this experiment, and it is believed that this may have helped lead to the development of cochlear implants, which is, of course, an incredibly important scientific advancement. The worst part, however, while the cat actually survived this experiment, instead of treating it like a king for the rest of its life like it truly deserved, these scientists instead decided to kill it to see if the experiment would still work on a dead cat. It didn't. In our number 2 spot today, we have the smallpox pandemic. I'm sure at some point or another, most of us learned about smallpox and the epidemic, which is something that we luckily don't really have to worry about much anymore. But one thing a lot of people explained that they didn't know was how badly it devastated indigenous peoples. Europeans who came over to America brought with them a multitude of diseases that they would have had some immunity to, considering it was likely their bodies had encountered it before. But this was not the case for those already living on the land that is now referred to as North America. Indigenous Americans not only had no immunity towards this disease, but also their traditional ways of treating illness may have only exacerbated the symptoms. Because of course, how could you possibly know how to treat something that you've never seen before and with no help from the people who actually do know? It has been estimated that the spread of this disease caused the population of Indigenous Americans to decline by 70%. That is absolutely insane. There's a theory that this spread of disease may have been one of the only things that led to the colonization of North America. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Tulsa Massacre. This is one that many people, including people from Tulsa, explained that they didn't really learn much about in school. This event occurred on May 31st and June 1st of 1921, and it has actually been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. This happened in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and basically just mobs of white racist people went out and attacked black residents and businesses. What started this was when a 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland was accused of harming a 17-year-old white girl, and he was subsequently arrested, and there were rumors that he was going to be lynched. This of course drew a bunch of racist white people out of their homes to participate, but then a group of around 75 black men also showed up to make sure that he didn't get lynched. One thing led to another, and a firefight broke out that led to 10 of the white people and 2 of the black people being killed. After this, all hell broke loose. Just last year, the last living survivor of the massacre, R&B and jazz saxophonist Hal Singer, passed away at the age of 100. And just last year, this massacre finally became a part of the Oklahoma State curriculum, and it's about time. Only a century too late. I also feel like in that I didn't include, but I should have said, that thing after the lynching was like only the beginning of it, and then everything got crazy and way more people died, and it was really destructive. I just didn't want anyone to think that I was making it seem like it wasn't as bad as it was, because it really was.
Number 10, the 1904 Olympic Marathon. The 1904 Olympic Marathon probably had some of the most interesting competitors ever. It wasn't just one person who made this race bizarre, but a whole handful of people and strange circumstances. First off, the course was just absolutely covered in dust, and breathing it in caused a bunch of the runners to suffer severe internal injuries. So right off the bat, the race just totally sucked. The man who finished the race in first place got some bad cramps and decided he was just gonna hitch a ride in a car. Then he got out near the finish line and ran across. The guy who came in second place was given a mixture of different foods and chemicals, which were actually a poison used to kill rodents, but they were trying to use it as like a steroid to make him a better runner, and instead his crew ended up carrying him across the finish line. The guy who came fourth gambled all his money when he got to the United States and ended up having to wear full dress clothing to the race, using a knife to cut his pants into shorts. He then ate some apples during the race, got sick, and took a nap, but still came fourth. Number 9, Robert Liston surgery. We all know that medical practices throughout history were a bit dodgy, and they didn't have a lot of the comforts that we have today. A man named Robert Liston was known as one of the fastest surgeons in the 1800s, and you had to be fast because they didn't have anesthesia, so surgery basically sucked for everybody involved. Liston also became the only person to perform a surgery with a 300% mortality rate. He was performing a leg amputation surgery, but worked so fast he accidentally cut off 2 of his assistant's fingers. Both the patient and the assistant died of infection because the saw he used was dirty. The third death occurred when, during the procedure, Liston accidentally sliced a nearby doctor's coat. But just the coat. The doctor thought he had been cut open, went into shock, and died of a heart attack, leading to 3 people dying during an operation meant to just save 1 person. Number 8, Salem tomato trial. We're all well aware of the Salem witch trials, but you've probably never heard of the Salem tomato trials. In the early 1800s, tomatoes were put on trial in Salem, New Jersey because they were believed to be poisonous. The tomato was also considered a sinful fruit because it can act as a mild aphrodisiac. Only one man in the town defended tomatoes during the trial and even tried to bring about tomato growing competitions so people would be less afraid. He would also regularly eat them in front of everybody, leading most people to think he was completely insane. Growing annoyed with the trial and fear of tomatoes, he decided to walk in front of the courthouse with an entire basket of tomatoes in his hands. He then proceeded to eat the entire pile of tomatoes as a crowd gathered around and watched, and to their shock, the man did not immediately die. This was enough to finally convince people that tomatoes were not evil. Number 7. Wojtek. During the Second World War, the Polish army recruited one of the most unique soldiers ever, a bear named Wojtek, and based on the soldier's accounts, he was actually pretty damn cool. The Polish soldiers found the bear cub by the side of a road, his mother apparently having been killed by hunters. So the soldiers took him in and raised him, and a civilian refugee even helped to train the animal. In order to get him on a British transport ship, he was officially enlisted as a Polish soldier, being given a paybook, serial number, and the rank of private. He would apparently sleep in the bunks with the other soldiers and was also a huge fan of beer and cigarettes. He also would do actual work for the army, helping to transport supplies and carry heavy boxes of ammunition. After the war, he was relocated to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he lived out the rest of his days, passing away at the age of 21. The average lifespan of a bear is 20 to 30 years, so that's really not bad for a guy raised on beer and cigarettes. Number 6. Nuclear war. Did you know that we were probably a lot closer to nuclear war than we thought? Back during the Cold War in the 80s, everyone was preparing for oncoming nuclear conflict, building bunkers and hiding resources in the case of having to regrow a barren landscape. This didn't happen, and it was later revealed that we were saved from this outcome by a single man. In 1983, a freak accident where sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds caused a Soviet satellite system to indicate that there were 5 incoming missiles, which they of course assumed to be coming from the American military. A lieutenant colonel by the name of Stanislav reasoned that if the United States were actually starting a nuclear war, it would be a full attack and not just 5 missiles. So he called it a false alarm and, against his orders, refused to initiate their own nuclear launch out of retaliation. Number 5. New Atlantis. In 1964, Ernest Hemingway's younger brother named Lester sailed out to international waters near Jamaica and started his own country. Yeah, he sailed a barge made out of bamboo that was about 8 by 30 feet and declared it a micronation that was half independent and half part of the United States. So how did he manage to do that? He discovered an obscure law called the Guano Islands Act of 1856, which says that US citizens can claim ownership of unclaimed islands that had guano deposits, which, if you're not aware, is bird and bat. He claimed his new nation to be called New Atlantis and even wrote a new constitution for it, though this constitution was actually just the United States Constitution, with every mention of the United States being changed to New Atlantis. The plan was to use this as a publicity stunt to raise money and use the raft as a research facility. Unfortunately, New Atlantis was wrecked by a tropical storm just 2 years after it was constructed. Number 4. The War on Cats. Pope Gregory IX lived from 1145 to 1241 and became the Pope when he was already over 80 years old. He had a history as a lawyer and was known for putting a few different motions through during his time as head of the church. Unfortunately for cat lovers, Gregory was a bit of a red flag because he was apparently more of a dog person. He put forward the first ever church documents that condemned black cats as being instruments of Satan, effectively starting the war on cats and placing a target on the head of every black cat in the area. Shortly after Gregory's time, the Black Death came about thanks to diseased rats spreading the infection all over the place and leading to a lot of people living during that era having a pretty bad time. Some people blame the Black Death on Gregory's war on cats because they say, due to the reduced cat population, the rat population inflated, so they were just running around willy-nilly spreading disease. Number 3. The Siege of Weinsberg. Weinsberg is a town near the southwest part of Germany. The name of the castle that sits above the town roughly translates to Women's Faithfulness Castle. So why is that? In the year 1140, King Conrad III defeated the Duke of Welf and placed the town of Weinsberg under siege. The women negotiated a surrender that held the terms that they would be allowed to leave the town unharmed with whatever they could carry on their shoulders. Conrad probably thought that they were just gonna take their children, clothes, food, maybe a goat. What he didn't expect was for all the women of the town to take their husbands and other men upon their shoulders and carry them out of town. The king's people were like, yo dude, they can't do that, but the king was like, nah, that's actually kind of valid, and let it happen, saying a king should always stand by his word. Number 2. Astronomer's pet moose. A 16th century astronomer who discovered the supernova was known not only for that, but also for just being a bit of a bizarre guy. A few of his odd behaviors included losing his nose in a duel, keeping a jester/clairvoyant in his house, and having a pet moose. The pet moose was apparently just as bizarre as he was. The moose apparently lived in the castle with him and would walk alongside him like a loyal dog, and apparently also had an unquenchable thirst for Danish beer. Him and his pet became extremely popular, and they would often be invited to dinner parties together to show off the moose's tame behavior. Unfortunately, the moose's alcoholism got out of control at one of these dinner parties, and he had a bit too much to drink. He chugged beers with noblemen until he managed to stumble up a set of stairs in the castle before falling off and passing away. Number 1. The latrine disaster of 1184. German noblemen during the Roman Empire would often meet to have discussions over land disputes and try to find some temporary peace. King Henry VI called for a meeting over a dispute which would take place in the Church of St. Peter in Erfurt. They all gathered in a room that was directly above the building's toilet pit. The weight of all the people on the floor, add to that their heavy chain clothing, caused the floor to collapse, and they all fell into the pit below. Between 60 and 100 of the people gathered there ended up passing away in the human waste, whether it be from drowning or being crushed by the floor. One of the deaths was Count Heinrich of Schwarzburg, who had previously joked he would perish in his own shit if he ever failed his title.
Number 10. Boiling. Yeah, throwback to the Middle Ages when we would boil people. Awesome. Any Game of Thrones fans out there? Some of this is too accurate. In 1531, the time King Henry VIII was unfortunately running the show, they made boiling a capital punishment. Say no more. I'm never breaking the law, ever. Not even thinking about it. Poisoning somebody back then was equal to treason, obviously. Therefore, it was agreed that you should be boiled, slowly, might I add, if you were caught tampering with a royal's beverage, their IPA. You know what I mean? You drop a little bit of something in there, you're out. You're getting boiled. That's horrible. That's the worst thing I've heard today. Number 9. The Battle of Zappolino. Turning the calendars back a little further, this time to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino was a large-scale event over a bucket. Yeah, I wish I was joking. War of the Oaken Bucket, that's also what it's referred to as. This beef was between two Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. It all kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal. What are they gonna steal? Are they gonna steal the Declaration of Independence? No, they're gonna steal a wooden bucket from the city's well, because, you know, resources were quite sparse back then. If you steal a bucket, that's equivalent to stealing, you know, something big. That's like a pretty big heist back then. The Bolognese declared war then, obviously, and then sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers, as well as 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Modena had a smaller army. They only had 500 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry forces. Thing is, these guys, they still won. Yeah, even though they had the lower force, they still got it. These guys chased the larger army way back to Bologna while destroying every town in the process. Now, some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city, which is pretty horrible, but I'm like, yeah, you know what? I kind of would too. I don't know. The bucket is currently on display still in Modena, so if you want to go see it, there you go. Go grab the kids and the wife. Say, hey, we're going on a trip. We're gonna go see a bucket. Yeah, bright and early. Number 8, the hottest wedding in town. It's January 28th, 1393, and you are formally invited to a masquerade ball. Oh, how lucky are you? Let's do this. The French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria is hosting one of the most lavish parties of the decade. When the French royal court was celebrating the marriage of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, it was a big deal, right? It was a happy day. For some, the best day of their lives. For others at this ball, not so great. King Charles VI, he had 5 companions perform a dance, this, theater routine. They did a performance dressed as beasts. They were committed to the bit, I'll add. They had masks, they had big baggy outfits, lots of linen, and lots of stuffing to appear as if they were real beasts. Good stuff, right? So far, we're having a great time, a dazzling time. The party was going well, wine was spilling, beasts were roaring, but one rule was put into place before this party even started. Absolutely, positively, no candles. Yeah, what an obvious fire hazard that would be, right? Well, the Duke of Orleans, he had a little too much fun prior to this event, and he forgot the first rule of Fire Club when he arrived. The guy walked in with a lit torch. Some accounts say that he dropped the torch by accident, others say that he got too close, trying to guess the identity of one of the beasts. Either way, flames were spread fast, and this tragic event took the lives of 4 people in total. Hence the name, you may recognize, Ball of the Burning Men. Number 7. Medieval pub night. Okay, it's almost the weekend now. We're starting to get ready to see friends, maybe hit up the local pub. Now, imagine for a second that it's the 14th century. What are we doing, right? You and your friend decide to hit the big city, the big medieval city, right? Check out one of those hot new medieval taverns that every peasant from the north keeps talking about. Now, you can't get an Uber quite yet, so instead, here's what you should expect. For starters, unless you somehow had a horse in the 14th century, bravo, it's like having a Tesla. Nice, must be nice. You were walking quite a ways just to get to the tavern. And if the commute didn't kill you, the disease waiting in the city probably would. Living in the medieval city was horrible. It was isolated, it was dirty, it was filled with rats, crime, strict curfews had to be put into place, violent crimes would happen all night long. Number 6. Roman punishments. This was a form of capital punishment used, of course, in ancient Rome, and also used in the Middle Ages as well, but its origins go back quite a ways. Yeah, metal would be heated up in a cauldron for a very long time, just hot metal, to the point where it was molten, just a soup of minerals. And at that point, they would pour said molten mineral soup down the throat of the accused. Yeah, this is why you don't break the law in the Dark Ages. Say no more. This was for the worst of the worst, obviously. It was execution by molten metal. It was supposedly done to wealthy Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus back in ancient Rome. So yeah, like I said, the OGs go way back. The metal would burn your muscle inside, literally cooking it from the inside out, and after a few moments, of course, it would harden and you would, yeah, horrible? I agree. Let's hit that thumbs up, get the karma back up, get that energy back up, and let's move on. Number 5. Plague rats. Yeah, just kidding, it's all disgusting. Say we go to the medieval pub, right? Say we beat the odds and we arrive. That's a feat in itself. We reserved the table, we're in, now you're with your friends and family, drinking ale, having a great time. Well, it'd be a shame if, say, hundreds of rats started to swarm your feet out of nowhere, right? That'd be pretty mildly uncomfortable while you're trying to eat some soup. Yeah, the plague rolled, or rather crawled, into town back in 1328, and it lasted until 1350. And it was actually horrible. It was so bad. We think of our own plague here in history and we compare it, and I'll tell you one thing. I never saw any swarms of black rats attacking anyone's feet. Didn't see that once over the past few years. By 1530, the European population was reduced by 1/3, and rats were almost entirely to blame. These hairy balls of disease, they passed it on to everybody. They didn't have public transit back then, right? We weren't sharing offices, we weren't spreading disease that way. It was rats running rampant just under your feet. That's disgusting. Number 4. Combat of the 30. Now this battle was arranged beforehand, right? It was bring your shiniest armor and your most golden gal and arrive fancy looking and meet us at the battlefield in Brittany. Both sides got to pick 30 champions each. They had to pick the best knights in all of their land, all to battle each other. One side represents the King of England, the other France. Now this whole thing was arranged by a captain in the French banner named Jean de Beaumanoir. Now this event pulled in a crowd, drinks were served throughout said crowd, and this fight lasted a very long time. Again, it was entertainment. Hours went by and 4 French knights had fallen, as well as 2 Englishmen. So they took breaks. It was like a sporting event, really. And by the end of the whole thing, the English ended up surrendering after losing 9 knights, and the French in total lost 6. Number 3. Bacchanalia. Have you ever dreamt of joining an ancient Roman wine cult? Me neither. But in the 2nd century BC, it would have been a perfect time to maybe go and try it out. Ancient Romans, what they would do back then, they would gather in these cultic celebrations, all in the name of Bacchus, the wine god, right? Of course, let's all meet and get naked and drink wine. These gatherings would be held in private, thank God, or quiet areas of the woods. A little creepy, imagine bumping into that. And what they would do is they would dance, they would cook food, eat, drink some more, maybe drink a little too much, and then things would get a little sweaty. They would get a little intimate, if you know what I'm saying. That was the whole point of this Roman cult. You'd gather in small homes to dance the night away, you could say. Some accounts say people would often get poisoned in these ancient wine parties, so by time 186 rolled around, the Roman Senate voted to end these cult gatherings entirely. Number 2, a lot of cheese. 1837, President Andrew Jackson, he knew this, okay? He was ahead of the game. He knew cheese was the main event, so during his last White House party as president, officially, he ordered a 1,500-pound brick of cheese. Then he invited 10,000 of his closest friends, who I hope weren't lactose intolerant, and they all went to town. They made history that day, literally. To move such a unit of cheese to the White House from New York, let's talk about that. Here we go. Officials had to use 24 horses just to move this thing, and it had to sit for 2 years before they could even open it up and dive in. Prepared for 2 years and gone in 2 hours. And finally, number 1, pleasures of the Enchanted Isle. If you think Elon Musk is wasting time and resources, you should have seen King Louis XIV. What a mess. Back in May 1664, King Louis XIV decided to throw a big celebration for his mistress. He told all invited that the party was for his mother, but really the spotlight was on his lady the entire time. How mean is that, right? Already you're like, ugh, what a diva this guy is. This party though, So it was a week long. How exhausting is that? Louis went above and beyond to keep the party going. He had fun outfits, a massive fake palace, a big float that looked like a whale, because that's fun, I guess. And of course, to cap it all off, a ballet show, just to finish the week-long festival. And while setting off fireworks on day 7, however, the fake palace caught real fire. And at that point, everybody was ordered to go home.
In our number 10 spot, we have the mosquito experiment. This experiment is truly the most surprising one to me on this list. I cannot believe how many people don't know about this. Apparently, in 1956 and 1957, the US Army conducted a series of experiments on Georgia, Florida, and Savannah, where millions of infected mosquitoes were released into the public in order to see if insects could spread yellow fever. The result? Well, they learned that indeed they can. Of course, at the expense of the American people's health, as many died, many developed fevers, respiratory problems, stillbirths, and so much more. Allegedly, researchers posed as public health workers and asked people if they needed help in order to get close to them and observe them. Pretty evil in my opinion, and makes you wonder and hope that nothing like that is happening to us right now, but possibly at this moment in time, we are not aware of it. If you're liking this video so far, don't forget to smash that like button, as it will really help us out. In our number 9 spot, we have the Black Death. The Black Death is definitely one of the craziest events in history that is definitely taught about in some schools, but as this was so long ago, it's not as frequently spoken about like World War I and II, for example. It is also known by its other labels, the Great Plague or the Black Plague. And as you can tell by the title, it was a horrible widespread pandemic that killed from 75 to 200 million people. They say at least half of Europe at the time. It took place in 1346 to 1353. As you can imagine, such a plague during a time where no one could stay indoors and communicate online, there was mass chaos everywhere. People blamed religion, witchcraft, and anything they could blame. There's a very famous painting by the name of The Triumph of Death by Peter Bruegel that is supposed to be depicting the chaos of that time. There is so much death and things on fire, the painting is truly haunting to look at. In our number 8 spot, we have government testing. In 1954, the US government performed a series of nuclear tests in the Pacific Ocean called Castle Bravo, and the explosion occurred a little too close to the Marshall Islands, and it heavily impacted the people there. The Marshallese people had radiation poisoning, beta burns, and of course, as you can imagine, many developed cancer. After this event, the US created a new project called Project 4.1, where they examined and studied the after effects of the explosion on the Marshallese people, and many wondered, was the explosion perhaps on purpose so that the US could study the effects on these people? Now that would be a truly horrific thing if proven to be true, not that anyone would ever be able to find that out, but regardless, why don't more people know about this very serious event in history? I bet you the Marshallese people are still dealing with after effects. In our number 7 spot, we have the Nanking Massacre. The Nanking Massacre took place in 1937 to 1938, and even though it was only 1 year, a significant amount of damage was done. This was a time when the Japanese Imperial Army invaded Nanjing, China, and a series of killings and many other brutal forms of torture took place. It has been estimated that over 300,000 died, and the women were ordered to do unspeakable things to their offspring. It's quite horrific, so I cannot go into detail, otherwise YouTube will censor the video, but it's wild to me that not many know about this horrible event in history. In our number 6 spot, we have the Great Leap Forward. In Canada, we are taught a little bit about world history and then our own Canadian history, but I was never taught about this catastrophe, so I thought I would include it in this list. If you were taught this, then that's good, because this is definitely an event that everyone needs to know about. Between 1958 to 1962, a policy was put in place implemented by Mao Zedong, who was the chairman of the Communist Party in China, and this policy led to the death of up to 45 million people. How was this policy even implemented? Well, under the disguise of distributing the wealth and making everyone equal as a sort of utopian paradise, so that their country could surpass their competitors. But this quickly turned into people not being given food, which led to a projected 25 million dying of starvation, and when incentives to work were removed, violence was used to motivate people. Oh, and did I mention that food was only given to those that followed the party's every order? Pretty horrific and crazy to think that my mom and dad were alive when this happened. It was not that long ago. In our number 5 spot, we have the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion, also known as the Taiping Civil War in 1850, was a massive civil war that took place in China. The French, British, and American mercenaries were all involved. The country had suffered some major disasters, natural and economic, before the rebellion began, so as you can imagine, they were quite vulnerable. Also, apparently the Europeans brought an opium addiction to China. At the time, the Qing dynasty ruled China, and during this period, in comes a man named Hong Zhuang, who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This war lasted till August of 1871. It is known as one of the bloodiest civil wars in history, killing 20 million people. In our number 4 spot, we have 2 heads. This is one of the most evil things on this list, and for anyone that likes dogs, this one may break your heart. This was a Russian scientist in the 50s by the name of Vladimir Demikov, and he ended up being the founder of human organ transplants, which arguably is one of the greatest discoveries in the last 100 years. The amount of lives this discovery has saved is probably unfathomable. So to think that before this discovery, the same doctor was performing head transplants on dogs for fun for 5 years, it's just so hard to believe. In our number 3 spot, we have amusement park deaths. A lot of people don't realize this, but many amusement parks around the world have had tragedies. Ironically, because these are places you would hope to go to feel joy, not sadness. Lake Shawnee Amusement Park is one example of a park that experienced one too many tragedies. The park was located in West Virginia from 1926 to 1966, and it had quite a few deaths on its hands while it was active. People believe that the land was cursed though, because before the park opened in 1783, many young European settlers were killed on the grounds by the natives in that area because the grounds were already a sacred burial area for them before the new settlers took over the land. People believe that all of the bloodshed left a mark on the energy of the area, and that is why the park never had a chance. In our number 2 spot, we have the Soviet deaths. Here we have yet another event where the government has put policies into place under the cause of making the country more economically and socially competitive, but yet the people suffer tremendously because of it. From 1917 to 1953, under the Soviet Union, approximately 49 million Russians died from a combination of revolution, starvation, and the forced resettlement, similar to the Great Leap Forward policy. Apparently, this initiative was due to one man, Joseph Stalin. It has been said that this desire to build a new and better country at any cost and to keep his power is the direct reason for all of these deaths. In our number 1 spot, we have the Mongolian conquests. This is something people certainly know a little bit about, but perhaps not the extent of it. Certainly those of us in North America are not taught much, but that's probably because it didn't take place here and there's just so much history to learn. The Mongol Empire was one of the largest in the world, covering 16% of the earth at one point. It was run by Genghis Khan, a man who is said to have more blood on his hands than anyone in history. Approximately 60 million died under his ruling, and also many women were severely harmed during this time by the men, and it is said that Genghis Khan alone may have reproduced a ton of children, as people say that he had about 500 secondary wives. Yikes.